But yeah, we are obviously here to talk about, the Mortuary Assistant, which is, it's based on a very popular video game. How familiar with that game were you before you signed up to this?
Well, I got signed up a couple of years ago and the game hadn't come out yet. They knew that they wanted to make a film out of it, even in the very early stages. So there was a process of playing the game and falling in love with it immediately. When initially pitched, it's like, do you want to make a video game into a movie? And once I did the playthrough, I was like, oh, I don't want to make a video game into a movie. I want to make this video game into a movie because I saw the potential of it immediately. I fell in love with the characters. I fell in love with the entire world of the story. And there was just something inherently fascinating right from the get-go when you enter into a room and there's a dead person there and you're engaging in a procedure with one of life's great mysteries. It's just inherently fascinating. Like the mortuary science in and of itself, initially it's squishy and gross, but then once you start to apply it and get used to it, you realize that you know, it's one of those things where a caretaker of the dead who is genuinely empathetic person like Rebecca Owens is, that's the kind of protagonist I like, you know. Once we get used to the fact that there's nothing to be afraid of with the dead, that's when our real threat emerges, which are the supernatural forces at work inside of Riverfield's mortuary. And that really got to me because I think when Brian Clark constructed his game, I'm not really afraid of the devil, but these demons, they felt a lot more like depression and suicidal ideation and addiction. And those were things that I could really relate to. It was one of those games that comes in like stealth, where initially you're kind of taken in by the mystery of it, and then you realize that it just feels so personal. And when the attacks come on Rebecca Owens, that feels so personal too. That's what got me into the game. That I loved Rebecca Owens and I loved the setting and I was fascinated by the entire world of the Mortuary Assistant. And I knew that there was a movie in it, I knew that there was a story. It wasn't like we had to add stuff on top of the world that Brian Clark had created. He'd already handed us this beautiful story with these fascinating people and these really scary threats and these really scary monsters that are lurking around every corner.
So obviously, if you get involved, kind of while they were still working on the game, does that mean that you were kind of one of the first people that got to play the game?
I think so. I think many other people had played the demo, but then, I got to see some of the endings before anybody else did, and that was a real treat. And then you just got involved with the process of trying to figure out like what narrative do you want to tell? Because video games such as this one often have like five different endings. And we decided pretty early on, like Tracy Beebe, the screenwriter, decided that we were going to pin this whole thing on Rebecca Owens, which suited me just fine because I just responded to her so much as a character. She's a great mortician, but she's living in her work and not living in her life. And that was a lot like me when I was in my mid 20s. I way preferred being on film sets than dealing with the harshness of my own reality. Much like Rebecca Owens, my apartment was more like a hotel room, and movie sets felt more like home to me. And I think the mortuary feels more like home to Rebecca. She's more comfortable with the dead than she is with the living. And for that safe space to get disrupted, it just felt like it was so connected to people's realities. When you try to push down the stuff that is bothering you, it's going to erupt at you like a jack in the box. And that becomes very literal in the game and in the film when all the demons come out to play. They prove quite lethal and quite scary.
I think, it's safe to say that, a lot of the time, video game adaptations, they have a bit of a bad reputation. I mean, I think that in more recent years, I think we've kind of seen maybe a shifting, a turn of the tide when it comes to that. Why do you think that there is that kind of stigma attached to these adaptations? And, do you have any, video game adaptations that you particularly like yourself?
Yeah, there are quite a few. I think that the problem is that not all games should be made into movies. Certain games, they're experiential, they're events, but they aren't driven by character or plot or narrative. And that was the thing that was so great about The Last of Us that opened up those doors for so many people was people loved those characters. They loved the world that Neil Druckmann created, and they got themselves attached to those people. So when it became an HBO series, it was pretty obvious that that was going to work as a long form piece of storytelling. And what that show did that was very smart was it would expand on the story in interesting ways. Like there was a whole subplot involving the gay couple, and that's hinted at in the game, but it's allowed to be expanded on in a film. And those people were allowed to be characters, and I found that so terribly moving. And that I think that seeing how they handled it opened up doors for people like me and Markiplier when he did Iron Lung, and the folks who did Exit 8. We can see how narrative tools can be applied to experiential game. Like you play a game, but you watch a movie. Now, the way I think you translate that is by getting the audience to empathize with the character. If the audience loves the character, they're going to be deeply invested in the outcome of that person. And that I think is like replicable from gameplay to movies. If you identify with the people, you will identify with it in the form of a game or a movie, and then the game and the movie can exist side by side as companions. That was something that the game creator Brian Clark and I always talked about. We wanted the movie to have its own integrity and work as a movie in and of itself, whether people played the game or not. And if people love the movie, they can go explore the game for an interesting interactive experience, and vice versa. If they love the game, they can explore a deeper version of the lore and spend more time in an emotional way with the characters. All of that stuff felt very important to me and to Brian.
And what do you think about these adaptations that go so far from that source material? I was thinking, obviously, last year we had Until Dawn, which, although it's its own interesting horror idea, is very much, not the game that it's spawned from.
Yeah, I think Until Dawn as a game is like an extraordinary experience, and it is choose your own adventure. Now, I think the film, I think David F. Sandberg is a really smart guy, and I think that his workaround was to try to create a moving matrix where it's like every 10 minutes it shifts and you're into a slightly different genre. So I think that he was trying to translate something that cannot be translated into a narrative form from the game. Choose your own adventure. There have been examples of it, like Black Mirror did an episode of it, but the form of it, it's even then it's not quite doing a thing that movies do. Like that Black Mirror episode was a meta movie where it was like implicating the spectator in the actual gameplay. Now, I think Until Dawn was trying to just be a movie that was taking ideas from the game and reconfiguring it into a new form. Now, some people liked it and some people didn't like it, but I respected what David F. Sandberg was trying to do with it. I thought it was a very smart way of handling it. The thing I don't like about Until Dawn is I wish that the creators of the game were credited, Graham Resnick and Larry Fessenden, who are profoundly talented filmmakers in and of themselves. The fact that they were not really given the credit they deserve for the world that they created was, I thought an affront to their tremendous talent. Otherwise, I thought Until Dawn was a pretty good movie. I enjoyed watching it. That said, Mortuary Assistant is more along the lines of something like Last of Us or even Iron Lung, which are truer to the form of the game. We're not breaking the code of the game. We're more translating it into a narrative format. So those two things, so the game and the film can exist as closer siblings, in the case of our movie.
Yeah, and I think that's where, these sorts of films do work well because,
Mm.
you know, without a doubt, the biggest audience that you will get, the biggest, sort of demographic you will get are people that have played the game. So you don't want to alienate them too much.
That's
You want
right.
to have enough familiarity for them that, they can recognize it. And, like little nods and Easter eggs to the game. I mean, was that something that, you thought about a lot?
Yes, I wanted to think about it on both levels. I wanted to think about where to plant an Easter egg that people who love the game can notice and go, oh, there it is. But not create Easter eggs that are distracting in and of themselves, where like the viewer who has no familiarity with the game is frustrated. And it's like, well, why are we going down that blind alley that seems to have nothing to do with the main story? If it served the main story or it could supplement the main story, it stayed in. And if it felt like an extraneous path, then we would let it go. Like there was one scene in particular in the game that, if we ever get the opportunity to go again, if the audiences love our movie and we get to explore a larger, if we're able to do a sequel or another movie in this universe, there are elements of the game that Brian and I have talked about that we'd like to expand in future projects. We loved working together on this, and we'd love to do more stories in the mortuary world. We already have something in mind, but I think it all really depends on how audiences respond to this one. If they love it as much as we do, then we'd like to do more. And we'll see. We'll just see. It doesn't belong to us anymore. It belongs to the audience now.
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, you mentioned obviously earlier on Rebecca Owens, she is such a, integral part of this. And you've got, Willa Holland playing her. I guess she's best known to, to most audiences for her work on, the OC and Arrow. What was it about, her as a performer that made her right for this role?
Well, I also saw her in a really great Beverly Cleary adaptation called Tiger Eyes, where she gave a very sensitive, very nuanced performance. And then she also worked with my Slapface. My previous film, Slapface, was produced by Mike Manning, and he produced a film with Willa in it called The Dirty South. And she was great in that movie. She gave a performance where her character is kind of hanging back a little bit. She's kind of hard to get to know, which makes you, as the audience member, lean forward. You want to know her more. And I love people like that in my real life experience. Sometimes you form your best friendships with the people who are a little wary and are not inclined to trust you right away, but then you earn their trust. Willa played that so thoughtfully and so beautifully. So when the casting director brought her up, and when Mike Manning told me how great she was to work with, it was kind of a no-brainer. Willa is an extremely interesting person, and I wanted the character of Rebecca Owens to, kind of want desperately to be participating in reality, but being afraid of it. And Willa understood that very deeply because she's been in show business her entire life. When she was a child, she was on movie sets. When she was a teenager she was on movie sets. And like it made Willa kind of feel a little bit disconnected from reality. And the Willa that I met really wants to participate in reality. That's a quality that I wanted in Rebecca Owens. And she didn't have to play it, she didn't have to act it, she just understood it. And I think within that, she gave the role tremendous nuance. I particularly loved her work in the Narcotics Anonymous scene, where a character who is very shy and not forthcoming wants to share her experience with other people desperately. And Willa cared about that scene tremendously because she wanted to honor the people who are in Narcotics Anonymous. I know when I read that scene in the script, it made me love Rebecca Owens all the more because she's going through a struggle and she's that kind of person who we want her to get on the other side of that struggle. And weirdly, this movie is all about that kind of a test. Like everything that she doesn't want to look at and doesn't want to deal with is coming right at her to attack. And that I think personalizes the movie in a way that makes it not just a Jack in the Box story or a jump scare movie, but like something where, you know, it's like we want her to get to the other side of her problems, or at least I do. I love Rebecca Owens as a person. I see a lot of my struggles from my 20s in that character. So, that's what we were going for with her, and I think that's what Willa brought to the character. I'm very grateful for the collaboration.
Hmm. I think as well, just touching on like her characters in in the OC and Arrow. I think both of those characters at some point were touched by addiction, whether it be her characters directly or those around her. So I guess in a way, audiences that maybe do only know her from those kind of like more well-known properties, it they almost work as a backstory for Rebecca, kind of filling in the bit before we get to her in the film almost.
Yes, and we also want the previous characters that she played to step up into being a hero, it's something that I thought that Willow has always been really good at is like that damaged bird who learns to fly, and I just think that that's her special quality as a performer.
And also on the cast, you have fellow filmmaker, John Adams. It's always kind of a bit like seeing a unicorn, I think, when you see one of the Adams family like outside of one of their own projects. How did you get John involved, and what was it like having another director on set with you?
I'm glad you brought up John Adams because he's one of my favorite people. So we were casting for Rebecca's dad, and I called up John. And he's like, don't tell me about don't send me the script. Tell me about the character because I want to see if it's in my wheelhouse. I don't want to play it if it's not in my wheelhouse. And I said, well, okay. He's a he's a loving dad that is very empathetic and will do anything for his children. So the love that you have for Zelda and Lulu that is so close and so tight and so real, Like that's something that the character has. He's like, all right, all right. And then I go, and you also have to play him as a demon who is saying the worst things to his children, like the version of the dad that is a punk rock monster, that is on the attack. And like any day that your children are royally pissing you off and you just want to murder them, like go into that part of yourself. He's like, I know what that is. I can play both of those things. I'm your man. And then John was beautiful on set. He's a great artist. He's a sensitive soul. He's my friend. He's also a director, so he knows what you're up against, and he won't cause you any problems. And he also really cared about it. I think his favorite day was he's got a scene where, as the loving dad, he's talking to Rebecca, and we did two takes. And I said, play one as if you're talking to Zelda, and play one as if you're talking to Lulu. And he smiled and said, well, that's kind of like talking about somebody who's made of string and feathers and somebody who's made of steel. They're going to be very different performances. And I was like, well, let's see what happens. And then in the scene, most of it is played towards Zelda, and then the button on it is played towards Lulu. But I appreciated his relationship, his very specific relationship to his children, because he could play that in the scenes with Rebecca Owens.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of look on paper and, it's almost as if the part was written, specifically for John.
He was my dream actor for the role. And he said yes. And he hopped in his truck and he came out and we had a wonderful time together. I would work with John Adams anytime.
Yeah, he's absolutely great. And what was the most challenging aspect, when it came to making it feel akin to the game? Was there anything that kind of, we talked about sort of like putting Easter eggs and things in, but was there anything that was particularly challenging when it came to, replicating the feel of playing a game to watching a film?
Um, Yeah, well, I think that was really kind of the fun of it for me, because I didn't want to use video game movies as references. I went back and watched Silence of the Lambs, which is a great movie, first of all. But then, like, the thing that that movie does is it puts you in the perspective of Clarice Starling. And sometimes it literally is like a close-up of Jodie Foster, followed by her POV going down a hallway, particularly in the very scary final act of that film. But even in other scenes, I knew how we could translate video game to narrative cinema through some of the things that Jonathan Demme did in that movie, such as, when Clarice is doing anything, if she's on the move, the camera is on the move with her. If she's paralyzed or if she feels small, the camera makes her small. And then there's a beautiful moment of realization where she's at Buffalo Bill's house, and one of the little moths flies by, and she looks up, and the camera kind of follows her gaze, and then it comes back down and lands on her. And I was like, that's how you adapt a video game and make the viewer connect to the character and the actor. And you're not moving, you're not playing the game, moving the piece, but you are following this character and making discoveries with her. It's all about empathizing with the character. And Silence of the Lambs is one of the most empathetic, beautiful, humanistic, and scary movies that I've ever seen.
Mm. And obviously, a big component, particularly at the beginning of the film, is the role of a mortuary assistant. There's a lot of embalming and things going on. How much research did you have to do into that process to make sure? Because it's obviously to a point you want it to read as accurate, on screen, but then at the end of the day, it is still a work of fiction.
That's right. I spoke to a lot of mortuary assistants. I spoke to a lot of young women in their early 20s who reminded me a lot of Rebecca Owens. And it's funny because they were very shy talking about their personal lives, but very open to talking about mortuary science. It's kind of like when you're talking to a film nerd like me, and all I can do is drop references to films. They love mortuary science, and I grew to love it too. Like once your initial squeamishness is taken away, then the actual practice of it is really quite interesting, and it's like opening a door into a taboo that we don't want to talk about. But the more you look at the actual mortuary science, the less grotesque it becomes. The more fascinating it is. I think we're all kind of fascinated by what happens to us after we die and who takes care of us after we die. And these mortuary assistants that I interviewed and spoke to, they made me feel a lot safer as custodians of the dead. It's like when I pass away, those are the people I would want to take care of me. Now we announce right away how squishy and squeamish this is. Like our opening scene involves cutting up parts of bodies and sticking tubes in there. And we want the audience to know right away, like we are doing this. We are going right into it. But I think that the more you see tubes going into a dead body, like once the initial shock has worn off, then you're like, oh, the dead aren't so scary. It's actually the the voices in our head or the things that are coming at us to attack us. It's like the living entities, or even like the scary parts of our minds that are the most damaging. We have nothing to fear from the dead.
Yeah. And obviously, because, Rebecca, she is the assistant, she's doing a job. I mean, this is all, there's a lot of practical effects in this. And I guess, you've also got your lead actor, interacting with these practical effects, to do the job of the character. I mean, that must have been quite interesting because there's a lot of the time when it comes to practical effects, it's, the effects team, but, to some degree, Willa would have had to have been, jabbing pipes into various things.
Yes. Well, I should highlight our special effects artist, Norman Cabrera, who's a brilliant genius, a mad brilliant genius. I mean, he's worked with all sorts of great people like Guillermo del Toro. He did Vegetable Gremlin and Gremlins 2. He was a protege of Rick Baker. So we knew that the effects were going to be amazing. And I loved playing in the sandbox with Norman. He's like 10 years older than me, but he's like a little kid with his enthusiasm for these props and these special effects. Now, one of the things that we did when we were filming some of his special effects, we warned Norman in advance that one of the lenses we were going to use was a medical lens. There's a lens called the probe lens that if you put very close to these wounds that Norman are creating, they look like landscapes. We wanted the effects to feel like beautiful, macabre pieces of art in their own right, So I thought that Norman's work was exquisite, and the director of photography, Kevin Duggan, and I wanted them to be macabre, but also in their own way, beautiful and strange, and they're squishy at first, but then I think once you get used to it, you come to see the beauty of the things. But I'm also a monster kid. Like I love the creature in our movie, which is called the Mimic. I think it's a very scary monster because it's always existing like kind of on the sidelines and lurking and watching. And because it's so still, you don't really know what it's going to do. We had a wonderful actor inhabiting the creature suit named Mark Steger. He plays one of the big monsters from Stranger Things. And you realize when an actor is inhabiting a monster that it is, I mean, for all of Norman's genius, it is rubber and paint until an actor inhabits it. And then once an actor is inhabiting it, it comes to life and becomes this living, breathing thing. And even with the corpse work, like these actors had to have these things applied to them. But I think that the actors who played the corpses, who all of whom I found to be commendable actors and really brave and really smart and knew what they were getting into, but also genuinely cared about their characters. I think they regarded their wounds and the parts of their body that were distorted as part of their character's personality. I think that they genuinely took on the effects and said, this is who I am. This is my character in this story. So I thought that the actors playing the corpses were commendable and very cool people to work with and wonderful actors in their own right.
I mean, you kind of touched upon it earlier, but I'm guessing, if, this film does do well, that, you are kind of itching to, to get back into, a second story within this world.
Yes, Brian and I have been talking about it. I know that we wouldn't want to tell the same story again any more than he would want. People are asking him to make Mortuary Assistant 2, and I know that he has ideas for that game, which are like an extension of the world. So I think that's something that if we were allowed to tell a new, interesting standalone adventure in the world of the Mortuary Assistant, in much the same way that Mad Max sequels all exist with Mad Max, but Mad Max and The Road Warrior and Fury Road and Beyond Thunderdome each tell their own unique, interesting story within that world. Like I think Brian and I would be very excited to tell more stories in this world. But again, it's like it belongs to the audience now, and if they love this film and they want more, then we'd be happy to share. And I hope they receive the film in the spirit in which it was made, which was with great care.
And I mean, 2026. I mean, we're only in February, but it's already been, a phenomenal year for, for horror with obviously, the Bone Temple and even like Primate and then obviously Iron Lung just, doing incredible work from, a budget of nothing and literally no, like zero distribution to, becoming, what the second highest grossing film in the US this
Spectacular.
week. I mean, it must feel nice as somebody that has worked in the genre to kind of see it, taking off in such a, in such a positive way. I mean, it's kind of become the new superhero movie, whereas we used to get, two or three of them like every other month. It's now we're getting like horror films again.
I'm honestly so here for it, like the horror community is very supportive of each other, you know. Other filmmakers, it's like we all talk to each other. As you know, John Adams was in the movie and Markiplier was very supportive of the game and is looking forward to our film, and I can't wait for Exit 8 to come out. That movie looks great. The game is spectacular. And then Back Rooms is coming, and I'm really excited about how stuff is translating from YouTube and games and the internet and even like Reddit, and like it's jumping to the screen in ways that I find surprising. I find it very modern. I find it makes the genre still feel evergreen and young, and there are more discoveries to be made. So I'm absolutely here for it. I'm loving where the direction the genre is going, and I can't wait to see how it unfolds.
Mm. And I guess sort of my final question to you, why do you hope that audiences take a chance on the Mortuary Assistant? Particularly those that maybe aren't familiar with the game.
Well, we're all, the mystery of death, the mystery of death, it's going to happen to us all. It is the universal mystery that is going to befall all of us. And I think that that's initially what drew Brian into the game. And I suspect that that's what might draw viewers into the movie. It's like, it's the taboo subject that is done in a sort of cozy way because, once you get used to to doing the work, you know, then it becomes actually a joy. I love to be frightened, and the Mortuary Assistant, we were determined to make a scary movie, and it is very fun to be scared. So horror movies allow us to talk about things that are difficult to talk about, but in a way that is, very dark, very macabre, but also very playful. And I'm really curious to see what the audience thinks of our movie. But this movie was made for them. When I work, I in front of my computer, I write audience in big letters because I'm always thinking about them and telling a story to them. This movie was made for them, so I hope that they enjoy it.
Well, thank you very much for your time, and best of luck with the release of this. And let's hope that, in another year or two, we're sitting down and having a conversation about the sequel.
That sounds great, Kat. Well, it's always amazing talking to you.